Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. As you all know, the Earth's climate is rapidly changing, and it's already caused catastrophic impacts such as droughts, floods, and biodiversity loss. These impacts are expected to get worse unless we stop emitting the greenhouse gases that cause climate change. And there are numerous ways we could stop emitting those greenhouse gas emissions, but one way is for every nation to take responsibility for the emissions its economy produces and regulate those emissions. In the US, it's unlikely that we will be regulating greenhouse gas emissions without some form of state and federal policy. But for the most part, we haven't seen those state and federal policies. And the motivating question for my dissertation is, why haven't policymakers been making those policies? You might have heard from a lot of your friends, acquaintances, that the Americans just don't believe in climate change. They don't want government to act on climate change. But poll after poll after poll after poll says otherwise. Americans believe climate change is happening. They want government to act on it to help mitigate the effects of climate change, mitigate the causes of climate change. And yet, we don't see any action. There are some states. I shouldn't blame them all. But for the most part, we don't see any action. So big picture dissertation question, why haven't we passed many climate change laws in this country? I'm going to go through 3 hypotheses that I address for why this might be the case, which I address in my dissertation. First, that policymakers are simply representing their own constituents and therefore have justification for not necessarily representing the nation as a whole. Second, that policymakers just don't know what their constituents want. And if they learned what their constituents wanted, they would vote for those policies. And third, I considered the role that constituents play in the misrepresentation problem and say, well, maybe constituents just need to send a stronger signal to their policymakers about what they want, and then policymakers would make these policies. These are 3 hypotheses that I consider and explore in my dissertation, but there are a lot of other reasons why we might not have passed climate change laws, so I talk about those. And then lastly, I talk about some real-world implications of my research. So why won't policymakers vote in favor of climate change legislation? As I said, hypothesis 1 is that policymakers are representing their own constituents. I'm from the 3rd District of Ohio, and I believe that my constituents are different from the rest of the country, and the majority of them don't want climate change legislation to pass, and that's why I'm not voting in favor of it. So there are numerous ways that we could, or at least the most obvious way that we could assess what each state or each congressional district, state legislative district wants with respect to climate change legislation is to do a poll of every single congressional district, every state, but unfortunately that's prohibitively expensive. So instead, I use this technique, multi-level regression and post-stratification, and the basic idea of the technique is that we use demographic information at a state level and some political information at a state level to predict climate change opinions in each state. So that way we don't have to do an individual poll in every state or every congressional district. So I'm just going to go through what I did for my paper, which is I took national public opinion polls that asked both people about their climate change opinions, as well as collected demographic information, what their race is, what their age is, and so on. And then I combined that with information from the state that each person in the poll is from. In this case, I used the percent of each state that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And I created a model that predicted climate change public opinion using demographic information and percent Clinton vote. So for example, this model will say, what is the probability that a 25-year-old white male from a state that voted 44% for Hillary Clinton, what is the probability that that person will support government action on climate change? Or what is the probability that that person will believe that climate change is happening? We have demographic information and percent Clinton vote share for every state in the country. So that means we can predict climate change opinions in every state in the country. Here is one example of the results of my modeling. In this case, the opinion that I'm predicting is the percent of Americans who want government to limit greenhouse gases from US businesses. Just going to give you a second to look at it. These numbers are quite high. The average nationwide, like I said, was 78%. But you can see, even in a state like Idaho, perhaps you wouldn't expect Idaho to be very climate friendly in terms of opinion. Even in that state, you see the 95% confidence intervals in parentheses here. Even in that state, the lower end prediction is still a majority of people. So in this case, my model is predicting that a majority of people in Idaho want government to limit greenhouse gas emissions from US businesses. All of you should be thinking, do I believe these predictions? And really, you shouldn't, not yet. I validate the predictions numerous ways. I'm going to talk about one of those ways. One way to validate the prediction would be to compare the predictions with those gold standard polls that I mentioned before, where you're doing a random sample survey in each state. And while we don't have enough resources to do a random sample survey in every state, we happen to do the exact same survey that we did in the nation in 4 states: Massachusetts, Florida, Arizona, and Maine. And as I mentioned before, I predicted climate change opinion for multiple climate change opinions. And here are some examples: that the belief that Earth is warming, climate change is human caused, support for gasoline tax to reduce driving. And what I did was I compared the predictions for the 4 states with the state survey estimates in these 4 states. And I tried to see what is the difference between my prediction and the kind of gold standard state survey. This is what I got. Right here on the x-axis, you see every combination of the climate change opinion and in a given state. And on the y-axis, you see the absolute difference between the state survey and the model prediction. As you can see, the range is large. It starts from less than 1% difference from the state survey to more than 13 percentage point difference from the state survey. The average error, if you can call it an error because we're just comparing it to another estimate, is 4.1% percentage points. Importantly, the map that I showed you was in general relatively good at being predicted by the model. All of the predictions were within 5 percentage points of the state surveys. And if you took note, the confidence intervals around the predictions were actually a bit larger than 5 percentage points, about 7 percentage points. So the predictions that I showed you were perhaps pretty precise. Like I said, there are a couple other ways that I validated these estimates. We can talk about them later. So going back to my big picture question, why don't policymakers pass climate change legislation? My first hypothesis was that they're just representing their own states. They're representing their own congressional districts. So it seems like that's not true. It seems like maybe their states want it and they're still not voting in favor of it. Okay, so maybe they just don't know. They just don't know that their constituents want climate change legislation, and if they learned that information, maybe they would change their mind. So you might be surprised that policymakers who are kind of famous for polling everything before they say it wouldn't know that their constituents want any policy, specifically climate change policy. But it turns out there's actually quite a bit of evidence that suggests that policymakers misperceive what their constituents want. And in fact, there's some evidence that suggests that they consistently perceive that their constituents are more conservative than they really are. So what I did was I decided to show the map that I just produced for you to a bunch of state legislators, state policymakers. We went to, a couple colleagues and I went to the National Conference of State Legislators. We were in the exhibition hall there. We had a booth. As policymakers were walking by, we bugged them and asked them to come take our survey. And in this survey, it was a survey experiment. First of all, we got 188 people. And in this survey experiment, a random selection of the people who walked by and took the survey were assigned to either see the map that I just showed you, or they were assigned to see nothing. And then they were asked questions about what they thought their constituents believed. And then they were asked about their own support for a greenhouse gas emissions reduction bill. My hypothesis is that policymakers who saw the widespread support for greenhouse gas emissions reduction would be more willing to vote in favor of this climate change bill. So just as a reminder, this is what the map looked like. We also gave them a couple bullet points of information about how the predictions were produced and how they were validated. Okay, so here's the first question that the policymakers saw. What % of residents in your state do you believe that the government should limit the amount of greenhouse gases that US businesses put out? So on the left side here is the control, the group that didn't see the map. On the right side is the group that did see the map. And on the y-axis, it's the percent of the state that policymakers perceive support government limiting greenhouse gases. Blue for Democrat and Independent, red for Republican. So you see here, as expected, as I hypothesized, that in the control condition, the perceived % of support for the climate change legislation is lower than in the treatment condition. And Democrats and Republicans kind of move up the same amount. They kind of, as expected, Republicans kind of perceive less than 40% of their constituents want greenhouse gas emissions reductions by government regulating, and then they jump up to a little over 50% when they see the map. You may recall that the map actually had much higher numbers. But anyway, Democrats do the same. They jump up to over 60% from about 55 in the control. Okay, so I kind of fed them the state numbers. I literally told them, this is the % of your state that wants this. So the same thing could happen, as I was saying, for the nationwide legislators, right? So it could be that someone from Columbus, Ohio says, well, my city is different, my district is different from the state as a whole. So maybe they won't update as much when they were asked about the residents in their district. That is largely not the case. They do update a little bit less, but they are still updating, especially Republicans. So in the control condition, again, that didn't see the map, they believe that a little over 30% of Republicans believe that a little over 30% of their constituents want government to limit greenhouse gases, and it jumps up to over 40 in the treatment. Democrats also move from around 62 to 67. Okay. It's easy to change your beliefs about your constituents, maybe beliefs about your state, but are they willing to change their willingness to support a climate change policy themselves? So here's a question that I asked them. Imagine if a bill were introduced in your state which requires that economy-wide greenhouse gases are reduced by 100% by 2050. How likely would you be to vote for this bill? If they said extremely likely, I coded that as them wanting 100% emissions reduction by 2050. If they said anything other than extremely likely, I asked them this follow-up question. What percent of greenhouse gas reductions by 2050 would you vote to require in your state instead? So on the y-axis, we have the preferred percent of emissions reduction in their state. So if they said 20% instead, then they're 20% on here. Here you see a lot more differences between the blue and the red. So the blue, the Democrats and independents, even before they saw the map, were quite supportive of voting for this bill. The plurality of them wanted 100% emissions reductions by 2050. But Republicans were at 17%. Those that didn't see the map wanted only a 17% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when asked. But those that did see the map were willing to accept a 42% emissions reduction bill because perhaps their constituents wanted it. We don't know, but that could be it. And so this is some evidence for my hypothesis that maybe policymakers just don't know what their constituents want, and maybe they're willing to update their opinions, update their attitudes towards various policies once they learn what their constituents want. Okay, but they still don't know in general what their constituents want. That is a problem. And so perhaps constituents play a role in that, a role in this kind of misrepresentation problem. Because as I said, some research shows that policymakers are consistently underestimating how progressive their constituents are. So what constituents could do is to perhaps engage in environmental political activism to demonstrate, hey, we really, really want this climate bill, and if you don't vote for it, we're not going to vote for you. So the focus of this chapter was what motivates constituents to engage in environmental political activism? What gets them to get off their couch and go attend a rally or call their member of Congress? There's a little bit of a gap here, which is that I'm assuming that constituents engaging in political activism would actually change their policymakers' behavior, change their vote. And there is some research on that, but not enough. I'm focusing solely on what motivates political activism, and we'll leave the other half of the puzzle for someone else or me later. So Okay, proposed drivers of environmental political activism. There is a lot in the literature that people say that if only people knew that they could influence policy, they'd engage in political activism, or if only they knew that others were engaging in political activism, they'd do the same thing. I explored several drivers of political activism, but I'm going to talk about two right now. First, the belief that their activism, along with others, can influence policy. So if we go out to this rally, we could actually make a change in policy. That is called group efficacy. Another driver of political activism in the literature is feelings of anger, and perhaps specifically feelings of anger towards the current state of policy or the potential policy that might come about. A third driver of political activism I consider that I'm talking about today is you might believe that you can change policy, or that you might feel angry, but unless you think climate change is extremely important, you're not gonna go out to that rally because there's so many issues, and maybe you think something else is important. You only have a little bit of time, so really prioritizing climate change, thinking that climate change is extremely important, means that you're a member of the climate change issue public. And my hypothesis is that those that are members of the climate change issue public are a little more likely to engage in environmental political activism. So again, I do a survey experiment, and the idea of this experiment is to kind of dial up feelings of anger or group efficacy by showing people some messages in the survey. I'll give you a background of the survey, and then I'll show you the messages again. So this survey was done with a sample of participants online. We only included responses of people who believed climate change is happening and supported government action on climate change. And the reason is I'm proposing that anger is an important motivating factor for environmental political activism. And there's not really a reason to be angry if you don't want climate change policy right now. We ended up with about 4,000 complete responses. And as I said, we had, again, an experiment. And so a subgroup of the people were looking at these treatment billboards with messages about climate change. And then a control group received a different message that had nothing to do with climate change, but it looked similar. And then we measured willingness to engage in political activism. So they were saying how likely they would be to attend a rally or call a member of Congress in the next 12 months to ask them to do things to address climate change or push for climate change legislation. So here's an example of one of the treatment billboards. And the purpose of this treatment, I call it the ENV Groups billboard. And the purpose of the treatment billboard is to, like I said, dial up this feeling of group efficacy, this belief that I, along with others, can really influence policy. So I find that the treatment billboard slightly increases one of the environmental political activism measures that I asked about in the survey. And specifically, I tested whether it increased willingness to engage in environmental political activism by increasing this feeling of group efficacy. And it seems like when I added into the regression the group efficacy, variable, the direct effect of the billboard went away. So that kind of suggests that it seems to be that the mechanism through which the message is increasing willingness to attend a rally is by dialing up this feeling of group efficacy. But it's not confirmatory evidence of that. So this billboard was meant to increase people's feeling of anger about climate change policy. And I find actually that the billboard that was meant to increase feelings of anger had no effect on willingness to engage in political activism, which might be surprising to you. We hear, I certainly have received a lot of emails in my lifetime asking me to be angry about various climate change policy issues. And it seems like at least that message alone didn't seem to increase willingness to attend a climate change rally or actually any of the other measures that I studied. So I mentioned before that I was trying to increase feelings of anger. I did increase feelings of anger, but I'm not going to consider this kind of mediating pathway because I didn't actually get the treatment effect. However, if you guys remember, I mentioned the climate change issue public, which is people like me who think that climate change is extremely personally important. And in that group, it seemed like there was maybe an effect of this particular message on willingness to attend a climate rally. It wasn't strongly significant, and it didn't really increase willingness to attend a rally that much, but it does seem like it makes a little bit bigger of a difference than among the rest of the population. Okay, so this chapter left us with some uncertainty about what it is that motivates people to engage in political activism. It seems that perhaps feeling a sense of group efficacy, feeling like, oh, if others work alongside me, we can influence policy, has some effect on political activism. But in general, and it seems to be the case that members of the issue public are also a little bit more likely to engage in political activism. However, it seems like we're not necessarily sure whether those proposed drivers, like group efficacy or anger, actually cause environmental political activism. And also, this experiment didn't necessarily effectively change the drivers, and so we're not sure whether this experiment necessarily gave us the best shot at trying to increase environmental political activism. So more research needs to be done. So my big picture question, as y'all might remember, is why government doesn't seem to be passing climate change policies. My dissertation's answer was really focused on what constituents want and how to convey what constituents want to perhaps other members of the public or to policymakers, and how that might increase the likelihood of passing climate change policy. But there are a lot of other people that policymakers are influenced by, other than their constituents. Corporate interest groups, public interest groups have a lot of influence on policymakers, and in fact have been found to have corporate interest groups specifically, and wealthy individuals have had disproportionate impact on policymakers' decision making. And policymakers are also highly susceptible to their party's preferences because they're part of a group, a political party, that they feel the need to conform to. And the political party leaders also have a lot of influence over whether they get reelected. And another limitation is that majoritarian preference doesn't necessarily win out. We have a lot of structural limitations in this country for majority preferences to kind of trickle up to actual policy, especially at the federal level, like gerrymandering or the Electoral College. And then lastly, perhaps cynically, is citizens don't necessarily only vote for people who match their policy preferences consistently. People vote for policymakers because of a feeling they have or because who their friends like. And so all of these other factors are certainly important to addressing my big picture question. And it's unclear what % of the problem is due to this kind of misperception of public opinion and lack of constituent activism. A quick some takeaways for the real world. So we can end in a productive way instead of cynically. The MRP predictions that I talked about at the beginning of the talk are actually like very, very common. If you look at political news pretty consistently, you almost definitely have seen these maps of state opinion or congressional district opinion, county level opinion. And as I showed you, the predictions from those maps can be up to 13 percentage points wrong in my model. They could be even larger. There could be even larger errors in other people's models. And it's important to, as a consumer, read those maps with caution. And as a producer of those maps, it's important to report the predictions with qualification, and at least share information about how the predictions were produced, if not also provide confidence intervals and other qualifications. More state and local polling on climate change policies, but on public opinion in general, could provide an opportunity to benchmark those predictions with higher quality surveys. But furthermore, you could take those state and local polls and actually show them to policymakers. And according to one of my findings, when you show the polls to policymakers, you might actually change their opinion or change their willingness to support specific policies. Environmental groups and perhaps environmental activists might consider focusing on state and local level policies when they're trying to influence policy, especially because of the structural barriers that I mentioned in the previous slide. And then lastly, environmental groups that are trying to motivate environmental political activism might consider focusing on perceived group efficacy, increasing people's feelings that, along with others, they can make policy change. Although, again, that recommendation requires a little more evidence. And to combine these last 2 points, it might be the case that people are willing to engage in, or actually have higher feelings of group efficacy when they are trying to make policy change on a slightly smaller scale. So perhaps a group can inherently increase people's perceived efficacy just by trying to make change in their states or in their towns. Those are my takeaways, and now I'd love to hear yours.
Samuel, take her own.
Yeah. Peter.
Okay. I was curious if you asked policymakers about the percentage of their own voters who shared those views as opposed to the percentage of their constituents.
I didn't, but I agree. There's, in fact, literature that shows that perhaps the more influential group of constituents, in addition to kind of interest groups and stuff, are people who are actually supporters and like people who would be perceived as voters of those policymakers, as well as people who are just generally engaged citizens. And I will say that I mean, that's a very reasonable, it's a very reasonable question, and it's probably getting at this discrepancy quite a bit, because per some interviews I've had with congressional staffers, they often, when they hear about a rally that has happened, they'll say, oh, that's just this subgroup of constituents, but that's not, those people would either never consider voting for me, or those people are kind of, they're louder than the actual voting bloc. So it is a reasonable concern. I did not address it in my survey.
For the polling questions and stuff, I was wondering, I think I've seen a lot of work about how like subtle differences in the way questions are asked around policies can have big differences in results, especially kind of like supporting action in a general sense versus like action that comes at a specific cost to the individual. How did you think about the way you phrase questions or in the polls, or and what effects do you think like that has around climate change?
Sure. Almost certainly, if I had said in the question, attending a rally is going to cost you $25, fewer people would attend the rally. So I agree with you. I think we were very careful. We were very careful to ask a question that essentially incorporated information about the fact that other people are going to the rally. So it's not just them. And we explained the goal of the rally, but we didn't. And I believe the question also included information that it was in a nearby city, for example, for the rally. So perhaps someone who's in a rural area could perceive that the costs would be at least driving to the closest city, but we didn't kind of give any information about the benefits associated with attending the rally or donating to an environmental organization. We didn't say like this is definitely going to cause something, nor did we mention the costs explicitly. But certainly, I was saying be cautious when reading or consuming MRP predictions. In general, one should be cautious about consuming survey responses, because survey question wording certainly has a huge influence on the results. Right, Dave? Thank you.
Really excited to see all this. I was curious to hear more about how you recruited your survey participants to your hypothesis.
Survey participants for the last. We used an online. I'm going to be transparent. I don't know the exact details about how these participants were recruited. We used a company called Dynata that collects the participants, and we try to kind of adjust to some extent, to make them look like a nationally representative sample, but it was certainly not random. And yeah, that's the information I can give you.
For both your second and third chapters that you look at, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the difference between sort of the stated preferences or stated willingness to vote a certain way or stated willingness to attend a rally versus any sort of revealed preferences. Like, do they actually show up, or do they actually vote on some of these pieces of legislation if they're going up, and if, sort of how much do you think these might be overestimates, if there's some sort of bias, especially maybe on the third chapter?
Okay. Second chapter would have been easier. All right. Okay, so let's see here. Third chapter. So it'll definitely be an overestimate. Like, actually, just like you were saying, the cost of answering a question on a survey is much lower than the cost of actually attending a rally. But at the same time, depending on who this person is that's answering the question, there are also pressures associated with attending a rally that you don't see in the survey that you do see in real life, like the fact that all my friends are going, or how close or far away it is. But in general, it is certainly an overestimate. There is, I'm sure, literature out there about the relationship between stated willingness to engage in an action and the probability that they'll actually do it. But unfortunately, I don't remember it. So.
Given the other polling that exists from Yale, climate to kind of data for progress, can you go into like, it does have state and local, can you go into the methodology that you use versus the methodology that they use, and what are the differences there?
Sure. Just to clarify, the two groups that she described, Yale Climate Change Communication Group does a lot of climate change opinion polling and produces maps like we've seen, you would have seen it probably in the New York Times if you're a New York Times reader, maps of state level, county level public opinion similar to mine. Data for Progress is a new group that's doing the same thing on numerous progressive policies. Data for Progress, I don't think publishes the model that they use, but Yale Climate Change Communication does, and they follow. My model is quite similar to theirs. They include a lot of other state effects other than, in my case, it was percent Hillary vote share. They use the percent of vehicle miles traveled in the state and like a lot of other state level effects. They actually found a similar, they did do a comparison of their predictions and some state and local surveys, and their predictions were about, the mean error from the surveys were very similar to ours. So what they didn't report was that big graph that I showed you of all of the errors individually, but one might presume that they would have some variance in their errors, just like I did, although they haven't reported it, so we don't know.
Just to follow on that, why did you choose the percent Hillary vote?
It's a pretty kind of, I was actually following convention. Almost every single MRP prediction that you would have seen includes at least percent Democratic vote share from the last presidential election, and sometimes they'll add other state level predictors as well. And what I found—
As a predictor for being in favor of the greenhouse gas policy?
Yeah, as a predictor for that, yeah. Or anything, like literally any, like the original ones did it of gay marriage opinion or prediction that climate change is happening. So this kind of, almost every, it's highly correlated with the dependent variable, so people use it to get what they perceive to be more accurate estimates, but then they don't necessarily test if they're accurate.
Interesting. That was really interesting. I was really surprised by the findings of your third hypothesis, that the anger factor didn't actually seem to change much. And I was wondering if it's because, like when I read that, I got angry, but I also felt kind of hopeless because it's like, what are you going to do about Exxon? Spending millions of dollars. But is there any? Do you know any studies, or have you looked at all if you were combining those two messages together? Like it's not just one or the other, but
yeah. So first, I'll give a shout out to another person in my lab group, recent graduate Adina Ablis, who found that hope and fear together was better at motivating various like pro-climate behaviors than just one or the other alone. And I actually tested something similar here, where I gave, in addition, so there were 3 billboards actually in my experiment, 3 treatment billboards. 2 of them were relatively positive. You saw one of them, the environmental group's treatment, and 1 was negative. And the issue public members, when they saw the negative one alone, they kind of increased activism, but when they saw all three of the billboards together, their willingness to attend a rally and I think specifically willingness to call their member of Congress increased like highly significantly. So yes, there is some evidence that perhaps, at least from my experiment, that that both kind of a positive and negative message could increase political activism, but I didn't see that consistently. I kind of saw that in one case, so I don't want to make a broader claim.
Really great work, inspiring. I had a question related to the items you had. So was it 2 billboards that you, so a person saw one
there were actually 7 treatment conditions in the survey experiment. So 3 of them, so there was a control that saw it was like 78% want, like, don't want to tax middle income people or something like that. It's a real statistic. And then there was 6 treatments. One was the environmental group, seeing just the environmental group's billboard, and all of these were along with like decoy billboards, so it was trying to kind of throw them off the tracks of the experiment. One was the Exxon billboard. One was a billboard that said 78% of Americans want government to limit greenhouse gas emissions. And then there were multiple combinations of them. And yeah, that's it.
What I'm asking is, I just wanted to see if you were, looking for effects and factoring that out.
Oh yeah, so in this case, the analysis is like any time, so in this, like the results that I showed you, anytime someone saw the environmental group's billboard, this was the effect. So either if they saw it alone or with other billboards, yeah.
Sammy, thank you for this. This is wonderful, and it's great to sort of see this, the final product after like 4 years of hearing you speak about this.
Thanks.
And it's actually quite, gives me a lot of hope from my general state of despair about the possibility
surprising.
of passing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so my question is a variant of the question that he asked earlier. In the climate change regulation, sort of the classic collective action problem in which the benefits are sort of diffuse and long term, and the costs are immediate and very, very concentrated. And my question is about sort of an alternative hypothesis that is consistent with your results for the first study and second study. Not that politicians don't know what their constituents believe, and not that updating works, is that politicians actually have a relatively good model of weighing who the cost of climate change legislation is most going to impact, and weigh those voters' preferences more heavily. And what you're actually doing is changing their priors on relative weights, and not shifting their beliefs on what people believe, right? And I don't know if you can get at this, but I'm just sort of curious if there's sort of people don't vote in sort of a vacuum. It's not like climate change regulation plus health plus water and all these things. They rank these things.
Yeah.
And if you have a sense of like where climate change falls in the importance for voters in a sort of long list of things that they could care about.
Oh, so the question is where it ranks.
In part, right? Like
Okay.
empirically where it ranks, but sort of thinking about this more holistically as a collective action.
Yeah. Okay. So I think certainly it ranks low. So on most voters, like kind of issue importance, like nationwide, some polls have shown that at least among Democratic voters, it ranks very, very highly. So we should all update our perceptions about whether people want, Democrats at least, value climate change a lot. In terms of, I'm not sure if, maybe I misinterpreted you, but I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with what perceptions of the policymakers I'm changing. So I think you're suggesting that by showing them this poll, I'm updating their perceptions of the benefits that a certain segment of their constituents would accrue from passing policy?
The weight that some of their constituents place on the importance of climate change.
I see. Okay. So yeah, that's possible. One thing that I think would be a really interesting follow-up is to incorporate actual information on that, like on their perceptions about the weight that their constituents or the state place on climate change policy. Actually, in a different study, one way I think that constituents can communicate that importance is by actually engaging in environmental political activism, right? And in one of my studies, it was on a different policy, on electric vehicle policy, and policymakers were either given a poll, like the one I just showed you, or they were told that constituents had written letters in favor of the policy. And my hypothesis initially was that the letters would work better because they demonstrate a a large weight that constituents are placing on the importance of the policy, but instead, kind of like I had mentioned before, the policymakers, at least in their self-reports about their perceptions about the letters, they kind of said, well, there's only like 5 people driving electric vehicles and all of them sent in these letters, but then the rest of the public actually doesn't care about this policy. And so a poll might be like a happy medium where you're like expressing a weight that these people are placing, but then giving them like an actual percent of people who actually say climate change is the most important issue to me. I think that's fair. We can talk about it later. Yeah.
Maybe time for one more if there is.
Curious how you think about translating your findings, especially now that you're engaged in the policy space. How are you thinking about translating these results?
Yeah. Well, so at least at my new job, I get to work directly with environmental groups, and often, and they've already kind of come and asked questions about how do we increase action taking among our membership. So hopefully I will be able to directly take some of the theory that exists in the literature and test it out at a field level with environmental groups that I'm working with. And then otherwise, I was kind of thinking of a pretty academic route of getting these findings out into journals, and then maybe someone will ask me in the real world to present the findings to them. Oh, I work at this place called Analyst Institute, and it basically is works with progressive organizations and does randomized controlled trials to help them improve the impact of their work, and then spreads the findings out to other progressive organizations. Yeah. Acknowledgements, yeah. Okay. All right, starting with my committee, David. First of all, I often revisit the advice that you have given me in the first year and telling other people about it all the time. So I really, really appreciate the first year of advising that I had with you, and really appreciate the graciousness with which you let me transition to a new field. David Broockman, who is attending remotely, whenever I would go and meet with him, I would come in confused about multiple projects. And whenever I left left with a lot of clarity and confidence. And it was often like the most productive, it felt like the most productive half an hour of my month. So thank you, David. Jon, thank you for taking a risk on me. I had never studied psych or poli-sci or anything before I came to you. And I really appreciate all of the time that you spent with me talking through ideas and helping me just like clarify my ideas and become a rigorous social scientist, hopefully. And then Neil. Neil always provided me timely and incisive insights into my work, and was always like when I was at a crossroads with my PhD, so I really appreciate it. And then Rob, thank you for providing a really fun and thought-provoking lab group. I was genuinely excited to attend it every time it happened. And thank you for being supportive as I was transitioning to my time as analyst. Literally everyone else requires like an entire card, like individualized cards to thank them all. I am just gonna call out a couple people or groups of people. I really, really valued all of the feedback that I got just sitting in the E-IPER suite, agonizing over something, and then I just like grabbed whoever was around and asked them to help me. And we have that supportive of an environment at E-IPER, but then we also had like lab groups and dissertation working groups and other ways to get feedback from friends and colleagues. I have the most supportive PhD cohort and their partners and family. I I know how hard PhDs can be, and I've seen other people struggle through it and feel like it was a lonely 4 or 5 years, 6 years, but that I actually never felt lonely once I got to know my friends and my cohort. So, and then family. Everyone here, again, deserves their own email or card. I'll just mention Anand and Liz, who really brought family to the Bay Area for me, and also my forever role model, my brother. So thank you very much.